Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. So this month's talk is about well, technically linked to the Jubilee, but I thought that was just too boring to do Jubilee stuff. So we're basically what it is. We're looking back throughout the history of the kings and queens. We've got a very long association with the royalty of this country, over 1,500 years worth. So we're going to look at brief things. So we've got a coronation, a couple of murders, royal houses fighting each other, 2 rebellions, maybe 3 actually. Obviously, the whole city defeating a king, and the king ordered the start of government officialdom started in Gloucestershire. So we've also had royal tours, visits, proclamations, celebrations, and a royal mystery. So we'll get straight into it. Very, very early stuff we're going to start with. So we know in this area that the pre-Roman time, the Dobunni tribe lived in Gloucestershire, Bristol, North Somerset, Herefordshire. That's spread around this vale, really. And we know their leaders are the first recorded kings in the area. Now, we don't know very much about them, and we really only know the information we have is from archaeological coins that we found. So the Dobunni coins usually featured some sort of like a horse, a stylized horse, and a branch device, which archaeologists think could be a piece of corn. The 3 of the real good names we know is Bodvok, and we know Corio, and we know Catti. There are lots of others, but they're the main ones. It's a little bit complicated because the tribes seem to have separated into north and south, so some ruled at the same time as others. Throughout the Roman period, nothing at all, really. No kings there, but we know they emerged fairly soon afterwards. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a Battle of Dyrham in 577, where 2 Saxon kings, Cuthwine and Corlin, fought and defeated 3 Romano-British kings, Coinmail, Condidan and Farinmail. And this is the entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This is the Parker version. And just as an aside, if you ever want to look at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Corpus Christi College in Cambridge has it online. And this is where this comes from. And they're happy for people to use it as well, as long as you credit them. So this is where this one comes from. But this entry here, you can see on the left-hand side is the dates. Anno Domini it starts with, then it gives you the Roman numerals, the dates. And this piece essentially says, here, Cuthwine and Corlin fought against the Britons, and they killed 3 kings, Coinmail, Condidan and Farinmail, in the place which is called Durham. And they took 3 cities, Gloucester, Cirencester and Bath. It was obviously quite a major event, and it really gave the Saxons control of the sort of the Severn Vale area. And it's thought currently that Coinmail was probably the king or the leader of the Gloucester area, simply because he's in that order, and then it says the town's in that order. This is quite an important battle. Fought down at Durham there. They don't know exactly where it was. There are lots of variations where it could be, but we know it's a fairly important one. Moving on, by about the 1600s, Gloucester was under the control of the Wiki, the tribe of witches as they're known, and we know that there is a great hall which is described as the palace at Kingsholm. We know there are also ancillary buildings included in chapel there, which may have been rebuilt in stone by 800. We also know that at the time Edward Confessor, the great hall of the royal manor at Kingsholm, as it was termed, was a meeting place of the King's Great Council, the Wittangium, I hope I've said that right. And that helped raise Gloucester's status really equal to that of Winchester in London, which made it quite an important area. First royal burial we have, Athelred, Lord of the Mercians. He was ruler of Mercia after the death of the King Leof in 879. And by 883, it's quite complicated. We acknowledged overlordship of King Alfred the Great of Wessex. And as a side benefit of that, he married Alfred's daughter, Æthelflaed, which I'm sure we've all heard of and we'll look at in a minute. So Gloucester became Ethelred and Æthelflaed's power base, and they actually made it into a sort of spiritual, cultural and learning capital. It had that reputation today, I have to say. Before 900, they founded a new minster dedicated to St. Peter, later renamed St. Oswald's, after the bones of the Northumbrian king and martyr St. Oswald were brought there in what probably seems to be quite a daring commando raid into sort of Viking territory. Athelred died in 911 and he was buried in St. Oswald, so it's really the first true royal burial in Gloucestershire that we know about. And again, we've all known St. Oswald's, and there's that beautiful decorated stone that's been found, which is highlighted in colour on the right, so you can pick out the beast there. The second royal burial, Æthelflaed, Queen of Mercia. So after her husband died, she actually for a short time became the most powerful woman in the area, in the whole kingdom, sole ruler of Mercia. And she came to a power at a time when England was still made up of many kingdoms, but her successful military policy, she was a very good sort of leader of fighters, and her political leadership laid the foundations for joining these into the single country that we know today. She's quite an important figure. She died at Tamworth on 12th of June 918, and they brought her back to Gloucester, where she was buried with her husband at St Oswald's Minster. So again, the second royal burial we have in the city and the county. 1976-7, archaeological investigations at Oswald's discovered this wonderful sort of carved cover of presumably from a tomb, and it was so well decorated, it was clearly somebody of importance. So they're pretty sure it was either the grave of Athelred or Æthelflaed. It's in the City Museum now, which you can see. Work is ongoing, always has been. In 1983, they found evidence for it that soon after the actual St Oswald's was built, there was a large crypt with a chapel above it. It was added on the east end, and that was very, very similar in plan to a known royal mausoleum at St Winston's Church in Repton, Derbyshire. So they're pretty sure now that this crypt was built by Athelred to house her husband's bones, and also the bones of St Oswald, but also for her husband. And there's a very good programme, I think, of Michael Wood, I think it's the History of England, where they had I can't remember exactly, but it was, they had a computer-generated image of this tomb with Karen. He was talking to Caroline Highway, and they had stuff behind it. I'd love to see that again. I can't remember what it was, but it's worth trying to find out. So we've come to our first royal murder already. It was Leof with the dagger in the Great Hall. It took place in 1946, and it took place in a hunting lodge at Pucklechurch. Again, the events recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and the victim was King Edmund, who was stabbed by an outlaw called Leof. That's the entry. This is how it translates. AD 946. This year, King Edmund died on St Augustine's Mass Day. That was widely known how he ended his days, that Leof stabbed him at Pucklechurch. Leof was an outlaw, but he'd come back into the fold, but he seems to have snuck in somehow. We don't know very much about it. Now, I've got this next slide. The hunting lodge is thought to be here, but actually, this very morning, I found out that it wasn't at this place, which was the moat house in Pucklechurch, but it's just about a quarter of a mile in this picture to the right, on a farm called Cranford Farm. There's evidence of an Anglo-Saxon hall. I wish I'd found that a little bit earlier, but that's where it was.
John, I'm just going to interrupt because I think there was a deliberate mistake there to catch out anyone who's not listening carefully, because you said that was in 1946.
Oh, did I? So it was 1946. Gosh, yeah, it'd be funny, they're stabbing the leaders in 1946. Yeah, so 946 then. Sorry about that, folks. Time you get carried away, don't I? Yeah, so we know this was there. And again, so the first royal murder in Gloucestershire, we don't know where Leof was buried, so he's probably taken out somewhere else, we think. Moving on, King Edward the Confessor established the tradition of public crown wearing at the major religious festivals at various places in the kingdom. It was basically a show your flag exercise, and we know these were Easter at Winchester, Whitsun at Westminster, and Christmas at Gloucester. So it still shows you how relatively important Gloucester had been at that time. After the conquest, William the Conqueror, he continued this tradition. He didn't say anything reason to change it. Now, initially, this would have probably been at the Royal Palace at Kingsholm, but may have been subsequently at St Peter's Abbey, which is obviously the cathedral, or possibly the castle that was being built. We don't really know. And it continued up into the mid-1100s before the royal kings got bored of it, really, and stopped doing it. Obviously, 1085, William's Christmas at Gloucester. This is when he ordered the Domesday Book, and it's obviously his greatest work and its greatest legacy. We don't know exactly why he did it. We think it had several purposes, primarily to record feudal obligations that were owed to him and justify increased taxation. There was a threat of invasion going on at this time, so he needed to know how much he could charge people, basically. And despite assertions by various bodies, we do not know where William was in Gloucester when he ordered it. It could have been the King's own royal palace. I think that's the most likely option. It could have been at St Peter's Abbey. Or it could have been at the castle, which was then being built. So they're all potential candidates, all have mostly equal potential, but I tend to come down for the King's Own Royal Palace still. And on the left here, this slide shows basically from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It shows you the sort of the explanation and the date, why William was thinking about it and how it came about. And on the left there is a picture of the first page for Gloucestershire in the Domesday Book. And if you've not looked at Domesday Book for Gloucestershire or where you happen to be, I do recommend it. It's a fantastic thing. It's just so interesting about how many sort of hides and mills and plough teams there were, things like that. Moving on, our third royal burial, Robert Curthose. He was Robert II of Normandy, the eldest son of William the Conqueror, but he was continually at odds with the rest of his family, including his father and his brothers. They really didn't get on, and they had various wars and sort of set tos. Robert died in 1134 in Cardiff Castle. He'd been a prisoner of his brother William for a good number of years. We don't know why he specified he wanted to be buried at the high altar of St. Peter's in Gloucester. Maybe it was something to do, he'd been there as a child with his father. We just don't know, really. But his effigy, now in the South Ambulatory, is of bog oak, which was frequently used for English tomb figures between 1280 and 1360. We know it was broken to pieces during the English Civil War, but it was the 1600s, when it was probably placed on that mortuary chest. And if you've not, everybody must have seen it, but if you've not seen it, it's well worth a visual look, because it is really nice. It's a really good effigy. So Gloucester hasn't always been good for the monarchy, at least on a few occasions. This is a sort of a laughing aside one, really. The 7th month of lamprey in Gloucester used to supply the crown with lampreys, as they were a favourite royal dish, not just one king, but several of them. We know that King John fined the city 40 marks, in fact £26,000 today, so it's a hefty sum, because they failed to provide him with his annual Christmas pie. Christmas pie was full of lamprey, basically. However, these fish did cause the death of Henry I, who died in December 1135 of a surfeit of lampreys. We know the mucus and serum of several lampreys, including the liver river lamprey, are known to be toxic, and they require thorough cleaning before cooking and consumption, because they accumulate these toxins in the body instead of excreting them. We know usually the lampreys pies are made of sea lamprey, but you thought they're going to catch the odd river one as well. It's because the two fish do exchange, they come in and out. And also, thorough cleaning before cooking. Well, thorough cleaning in medieval times isn't going to be what we consider today. Luckily for Gloucester, however, Henry died at Lyons-la-Forêt near Rouen in Normandy, so the lampreys were unlikely to have been from the Severn, although there is a reference to one of the bishops taking a lot of lamprey pies from Gloucester over to London. So these things probably did travel a little bit. Moving on, we come to our first civil war, the Anarchy, 1138 to 1153. Gloucestershire in this was one of the principal strongholds of the Angevin cause, primarily after Miles Fitzwalter of Gloucester, who was the first Lord of Hereford, declared support for the Empress Maud in her fight against King Stephen, who'd essentially sort of taken over the throne by default. Miles, together with Robert Fitzroy, the first Earl of Gloucester, they brought the Empress to Gloucester when she came to England in 1139. So she again chose Gloucester to come to, again showing how important this area was. From Gloucester, Maud controlled a large territory going out into Bristol, Wiltshire, the Welsh Marches, east through to Thames Valley as far as Oxford, which could threaten London. So it was a really important area. And after the Battle of Lincoln, 2nd of February 1141, Stephen was captured by Maud's forces. What became of him? Well, he was brought back to Gloucester, where he was brought before Empress Maud. He stayed there for a few days before he was moved to Bristol Castle, which traditionally has always been used for holding high-status pictures. And Phil Moss's drawing of Gloucester Castle, at its sort of height, is a lovely one. I make no apologies for showing this once, and we'll see it again in a minute. We come to the first of the royal charters that was issued by the Crown to Gloucester, this rather than the county, issued by Henry II, probably because he felt quite well disposed towards Gloucester because of the help it had given his mother, Empress Maud, against Stephen. And it granted the burgesses of Gloucester the same customs and liberties through all of my land of toll and all of the other things as the better citizens of London and Winchester had at any time in the time of King Henry, my grandfather. It's not a massive document. It's only about sort of 4 or 5 inches across. And you know, that's it. There's a little fragment of a seal attached, which I haven't included basically because it makes the reading too small. But you can see at the top there, you can see H. Rex and King of England basically. Very interesting document, well worth a complete read. If you see a translation of it, you can find it in the Deeds of Gloucester, Deeds of the Corporation of Gloucester by Stevens. We come to another one now, the Royal Charter, second one that's been issued for Gloucester, which issued by Richard I. Of course, he was always needing cash for crusading and everything, so his charter, 1144, reaffirmed the liberties of the previous Royal Charter, but demanded an annual £55 fee farm for the privilege of plus a 10 crown interest direct to the exchequer. So basically, this is where he essentially gave the sort of city to the burgesses for an annual fee, but they could then sublet and make money from people they let out to, and that money would go to them rather than the crown. We do have a rather nice run of Royal Charters in the archives, has to be said. I'm not showing very many of them. I'm doing 4 of them actually, but you know, they are really worthwhile seeing. We do have digital copies. We don't get the originals out very often. A coronation, Gloucestershire seen one royal coronation. That's Henry III, who was the son of King John. He was very young, only 9 years old at the time, but his guardian was the great knight William Marshall, and he was his guardian and defender, really. And they were brought to Gloucester with the papal legate to England, Cardinal Dalla Biccheria, and they oversaw the coronation on 20th October 1216. In the absence of the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, he was anointed by Sylvester, the Bishop of Worcester, and Simon, the Bishop of Exeter, and he was crowned by Peter de Roches, the Chief Justiciar and Bishop of Winchester. The story goes because the royal crown had been lost, either in an accident or crossing the Wash, or had been sold by John to raise money. We don't know which it is. The ceremony used a simple gold corolla, a gold band that belonged to his mother. Obviously, it was a quick one, very quickly done to make sure he couldn't sort of be challenged. And he actually underwent a second formal coronation at Westminster 4 years later. I think he's the only monarch who do coronations. Moving on to the Second Civil War, the Second Barons' War, 1264 to 67. Again, Gloucestershire was very prominent in this. This is when Simon de Montfort and the barons rebelled against Henry III. We know Gloucester Castle exchanged hands several times in the early stages of this war, until Prince Edward captured the crown for good. Now, this is one of my favourite documents. We hold an accounts roll for this period, and it records expenditure on the castle by the Constable Roger de Clifford, who was originally sided with the barons but switched sides. And this accounts roll dates to the period when Edward ordered improvements and repairs after he had captured it, because he captured it what he thought was very, very easily. And the roll contains really detailed information on the repairs and improvements, just defences and weaponry, you know, as well as details of the garrisons, the number of troops that were there, you know, their cloth they bought for their uniforms, that sort of thing. So it's a fabulous, fabulous resource. We also, interestingly, it has references to Prince Edward forces leaving Gloucester for the Battle of Evesham, where eventually Simon de Montfort was killed and King Henry was restored to the throne. And it's got these 2 sections in it. First one on Saturday, the Feast of St. James the Apostle. Sir William de Cheney came with another knight and with 8 other equipped horses and remained in the castle until the next Monday after the Feast of St. Peter's Chains, on which day they set out for the Battle of the Evesham. Now, obviously, we know this wasn't written at the time, it was written afterwards because somebody's writing what's happened to the castle at the time. And the picture on the bottom right there is actually what happened to Simon de Montfort. You can see he was basically cut up to little bits, essentially. Edward I and Edward II, they were rare visitors to the county. They didn't come this very, very often, and they passed through a few times. But in 1278, Edward did hold a parliament in Gloucester, which must have been at the castle. It wouldn't have been at the abbey at that time. And this is an important one because Edward enacted the Statute of Gloucester, which played a key role in his campaign to recover his rights against the barons. But with other statutes, it actually proved crucial to the development of English law. It set the basic standards for it, had been adapted since Saxon times. One of the main things, it limited the jurisdiction of local courts, which were largely at the time controlled by the barons, and revived the system of heir courts, which they had royal justices who would tour the land hearing cases on circuits, and this was a direct precursor to the later quarter sessions, so it's something you can trace back, for these courts for a long period of time. And of course, in Gloucestershire, we're lucky because we've got a lot of information on the heir courts, thanks to the fact that they were the heir courts in the Forest of Dean. And again, the Forest of Dean Local History Society have got a lot of information on those if you're interested in them. Coming up to royal murder number 2, it was who with the what in the cell at Berkeley Castle. So Gloucestershire is the only county that holds this sort of the odd distinction of where 2 kings have been murdered. This one is obviously refers to Edward II. In 1327, he was forced to give up the throne, and he was taken prisoner and kept in Berkeley Castle in the cell there. In September, so he'd been in there sort of 8 months. He was murdered in the cell. Now no one knows who did it. Lots of stories exist about how he was killed, some a lot more grisly than others, but I think the general opinion nowadays he was strangled or suffocated, so you can ignore the red hot pokers in the middle there. Of course, it gives him as a burial. He was taken to Gloucester Abbey, where he was buried by the High Altar 2 months later. We think this delay was partly to allow Edward III to come to visit it. We know the funeral was quite a grand affair, cost about £351, it's about 216,000 today, and it had gilt lions, gold leaf painted standards, and even had oak barriers built for crowd control, though sadly we don't know how well attended this was. We know there was a temporary wooden effigy made for the funeral, which was the first known use of a funeral effigy in England. This is probably necessary because obviously the king's body had been in a sealed casket for over 3 months now, and you really wouldn't want to have opened that, I don't think. It'd been sloshing around in there, I can imagine. But Edward III paid for this really beautiful tomb. I'm sure we've all seen it. If not, go to the cathedral and have a look at it. It's made of Cotswold stone and Purbeck stone. And the effigy, we know, has this pronounced lower lip. It's not brilliantly visible in this photograph, but you can see it. And it is thought to be a very, very close resemblance to Edward. And again, if you've not been there, please go and visit it, 'cause it's wonderful. Houses of Lancaster and York had relatively little contact with the county, although they did visit occasionally, if only to try and kill each other. But, we've still got it thanks to Shakespeare, Richard II, there's this Act 2, Scene 3, The Wilds of Gloucestershire. Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, comes in. How far is it, my lord, to Berkeley now? And Northumberland replies with his believing never, lord, I am a stranger here in Gloucestershire. These high wild hills and rough uneven ways draws out her miles and makes them wearisome. You do wonder if Shakespeare had ever been through the county because, although he's only up the road in Evesham for some of the time, high wild hills and rough even ways, wilds of Gloucestershire, I don't think so. Going back to the Royal Battle number 2, Tewkesbury, 1471. One of the decisive, if not the most, second decisive battle of the Wars of the Roses. So Edward IV's House of York totally defeated his rival House of Lancaster. The Lancastrian heir to throne Edward, Prince of Wales, and many other Lancastrian nobles were killed during the battle, executed afterwards. And then the Lancastrian king, Henry VI, who was a prisoner in the Tower at the time, he died and was murdered shortly after. And the battle brought about a period of stability until the death of Edward IV in 1483. And having said that, I think it's next weekend or the weekend after, we've got the reenactment of the Battle of Tewkesbury, which you've never been, please go and see it. It's wonderful fun. Not only is it beer tent music, lots of stalls, but the battle is one of the largest reenactments in Europe, so it's really worth seeing. Moving on to Richard III, his main influence on the county was one charter of 1483, and it granted Gloucester the right to elect a mayor from among themselves, so among the burgesses, rather than the king saying you must have this person. It also created what's called the Innshire from the hundreds of Dunstan and Kings Barton, and this was known as the county of the town of Gloucester. It gave the borough the right to its own quarter sessions court system, which was quite important. It also gave it a lot of ability to control what was going on in the outskirts of the city and also make some money from it. And this becomes important a couple of hundred years later. Again, Henry VIII and his wife, not a huge amount of influence, but we know they had this really good tour in July 1535 when they left Windsor on a royal progress for a tour of the West Country. The reason they did it was primarily to escape any potential plagues that might strike the capital in summer, but also to allow maintenance on the various royal palaces there. And their plan was quite simple. They intended to travel out here to Gloucestershire, go down to Bristol before circling back to Windsor in October. In the event, they never actually went to Bristol because plague broke out, so they diverted. This is the track of the course of their travels in Gloucestershire, and it comes from a website called henry8reign.co.uk, so thank you for them to let us use it. Being still, they stayed at a lot of places on the way. The royal column, probably 100 or more carriages and carts, and it's laden with everything the royal family might need, including the king's bed. They brought that with them. Obviously would have made very slow progress. So this is why one of the reasons they made lots of stops. They only travelled about 15 to 20 miles a day at the tops. We know what his itinerary was because it was written down in the King's Gestes, which meant the King's itinerary. And this is the 27th year of his reign, and it's from Windsor to Bristowe. Of course, you can do that. But you can see the places he came there. Let's have a little slurp while you leave that. We know that when he came to Gloucester, there was a major civic ceremony going on. So he's welcomed by the Mayor, John Faulkner, all the sheriffs and aldermen and burgesses were all in ceremonial dress. We think the couple would have stayed in the Abbot's lodgings at Gloucester Abbey rather than anything else, which is interesting, the fact that Henry takes advantage of the Abbey. Of course, in a few years' time, he's going to sort of basically try and take all the Abbeys away and dissolve them. He arrived at Painswick on the 2nd of August, and we know he stayed there for a while. They were hunting around there for 4 or 5 days, and of course, both the King and Anne really enjoyed hunting. Moving on from St Leonard, heads down south, arrives at Berkeley Castle, which at the time was a royal property. Then they stayed there for a week or so, again doing more hunting. Then they ended up going to Thornbury, which is also a crown property at the time, and did more hunting around there. And then to the diversion, they sort of went to Acton Court, home of St Nicholas Point, which is worth mentioning. Again, if you've not been to Acton Court, it's well worth it. It's a really nice place to go and visit. But in order to impress the royal visitors, we know at Point built a new wing. He built it as luxuriously as he could, modelled the rooms on those of Hampton Court Palace and Whitehall, but he did this in such a hurry that there were no foundations dug, and it does cause problems today. There are issues with it. They had to sort of underpin it and everything. The crown then left, and they ended up at Little Sodbury Manor. This is a diversion from Bristol, and finally they crossed out of the border, heading towards Bromham in Wiltshire. A royal burial number 5 now in Gloucestershire, Katherine Parr. She was the last of Henry's wives, queen from their marriage in 1543 until his death in 1547. 6 months later, she married her 4th husband. So Henry was her 3rd husband, so she got around a bit, this girl. And her 4th and final husband, Thomas Seymour, 1st Baron Seymour Sudeley, hence the connection there. We know she died 5th September 1548 at Sudeley from childbed fever. Childbed fever was a postpartum infection that claimed between 20 to 25% of all women giving birth, prior to the fact that somebody realised if you washed your hands and cleaned them, you probably had less infections. So that, very sad that so many people died as a result of this. She was buried in the chapel at the castle at Sudeley, but her grave had a history of being disturbed and damaged, most notably in 1792 when local vandals broke into the coffin and threw her corpse onto a rubbish heap. It's not a good way to treat an ex-queen. It was reclaimed and put somewhere else, and in 1861 it was finally moved into a fully restored chapel and a lovely neo-Gothic tomb designed by George Gilbert Scott, and there's a marble figure of her by John Burney Phillip. And again, if you've not seen this, it's well worth going to have a look. It's a really nice tomb again. Mary the First, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine Aragon, we know she's a devout Catholic, attempted to enforce wholesale conversion of England to Catholicism. Not a huge influence in the county, apart from the fact she ordered the burning of Bishop Hooper on 9th of February 1155 at St Mary's Square. So he was one of the martyrs, not one of the Oxford martyrs, but he was close to it. And of course, we've got that lovely tomb, not so much tomb, it's this I can't think of the word today, I don't know what we're doing, but it's the monument, that's what we're going for here. We know also during her reign, 284 men and women were executed on account of their faith. So it's difficult for us to conceive this idea of, don't agree with somebody's religion, you burn them or kill them. It's crazy. And also it's interesting that the fact, the local people, they obviously went to the burning, get warm, it's a cold day. But, how much did they support it? Were they just going for the spectacle, or, how did they support it? So it's, scary times. Moving on to a lovely story, we think. 1542, 9-year-old Princess Elizabeth was sent out of London to avoid an outbreak of plague, and they sent it to the manor of Bisley, which is owned by the Crown. That was now called James Court, which is just below this church there. Oh, well and good, you think, except, according to a local legend that's rife around the area, she caught a fever at Bisley and died. So, terrified of what the king would do if they said to him his daughter had died, the Guardians decided to substitute a local girl for the dead princess. But they couldn't find a female lookalike, so they used a red-headed boy. It was either, the story goes, as the princess's real nephew or a local village boy, and they disguised him as the princess. If it's true, who knows? The swap must have been really convincing. For obviously, Elizabeth went on to become queen and reign for 45 years, long period of time. Arguments say, the reason she's got to be a bloke because she never married, which was very unusual for a royalty, and she was later bold and had to use wigs. Well, I don't know. Is it real or not? It'd be nice to find some other evidence for it. Probably it's just a good local tale. Again, we skip a lot of kings and queens. We don't have stuff for everybody in the archives, but we got this sort of, James didn't actually influence us that much, apart from introducing the authorised version of the Bible. The main link with the country is because of the gunpowder plot, 1605. After Guy Fawkes and his Catholic friends were caught, there were celebrations ordered, and these do crop up regularly in the archives that we have, especially in the parish registers. And this is one from Painswick, Prestbury, sorry, for celebration for bell ringers and 100 faggots for the bonfire. So these do stay in this sort of the written record of the county. Probably coming on to our most famous period, I guess. As soon as Charles I came to the throne, there was a rapid deterioration between the Crown and Parliament in the country, and it was no different in the county. Charles believed he had the divine right to rule. Parliament had argued against this. Charles always demanded money. Parliament said no, etc. One of the most things that sort of really set the country on the way to war was his demand for ship money, and the fact that traditionally it's only the sort of ports and places on the coast that paid for ships. Charles tried to get everybody paying for ships just to get more money. And this is an entry in the Gloucester Borough Common Minute Book, which records the mayor meeting with the High Sheriff of the county, the royal appointment that he was, on Christmas Eve to discuss ship money. I mean, that must have been really sort of something else, that meeting. But December 1642, by this time, Charles had raised the standard to essentially signified war had started. So it wasn't until then that the actual committee was established to manage the parliamentary war effort in the county. A couple of famous members, Thomas Pure is the most famous one, and he was the only one who went through the siege, which we're going to look at now. So this is the third major royal battle. So while most of Gloucestershire sided with the Parliament, there were a few places that supported the Crown. These are mostly in the northeast of the county, where the people were essentially well tied to the local lords. Lord Sudeley was one, that sort of thing. And also, of course, Gloucester held quite a strategic position. The king had made his HQ at Oxford, so Gloucester really stood in the way of accessing the royalist recruiting grounds of Wales. And it also made supplying royal garrisons up the Severn at Worcester and Shrewsbury quite difficult, so Gloucester could bar the river. So Gloucester was seen as quite important. And after Bristowe fell to Prince Rupert, a royalist council met there with the king, and they decided they would take Gloucester. But Charles was actually very concerned because in storming Bristol, Rupert had a huge number of casualties. The parliamentarians had fought really well. And Charles was very worried that if they tried to do this to Gloucester, again, he would lose a lot of men, so it would reduce his army. So he basically decided to make a show of force, and hoping that if he did this, Gloucester would simply surrender. He reckoned, however, without Mr. Massey, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Massey. Only 24 years old, a professional soldier. He'd been with the Royals in the early stages, but changed. He did go back later on to be a turncoat again. But he shared authority with the civilian administration borough of Gloucester and a group of 15 older men. But many of these were officers of the city's garrison, so that meant the political and military command was well integrated and very efficient. So it was able to put up a very, very good defence. When on the afternoon of 10th of August, the Royalist army, led by Charles, comprising 6,000 infantry and 2,500 mounted troops, more came in, began assembling around the city. Charles set up his quarters at Matson House here, but his demand for the city's surrender was unanimously rejected, and it was quite insolently done as well. They didn't pay him any dues, really. So he decided that rather than storm it, he would besiege it, because he thought he could starve them out. The city's garrison, just 1,500 men, which are 2 half-strength regiments from the Earl of Stanford's regiment. They were recruited in London, Leicestershire. The town regiment, there was a company militia, 100 dragoons, and a troop of cavalry. So it wasn't very many defenders, basically. But Gloucester was partly lucky because it did have some of the city walls, Roman walls, surviving. We also had a few dozen artillery pieces, light cannon, to the biggest ones were 2 9-pounder demi-culverins, which again weren't that huge guns really. The Royalists were actually really confident they could reduce the city, and they even believed that even if Parliament sent a force from London, they could be defeated before reaching Gloucester, so they weren't that worried about it. But Massey took on a really aggressive defence, and then it took them by surprise. So he was continually sending men out from the city to attack the Royalists. And it quickly became apparent that there would be no quick victory here for the Crown. So, what's happened there? Sorry. Can I have that? There we go. No, cancel. There we go. However, Parliament did put together a relieving army under Essex. And basically, he started marching to Gloucester, took a northerly route to Oxford. And when word came that the actual army of Essex was approaching, Charles thought, I've got to lift the siege because now it's more important to try and catch Essex before he gets back to London. This led to the First Battle of Newbury, which, although sort of a stalemate, was strategically a parliamentary victory. However, unknown to the Royalists, the siege had really come close to succeeding because the city was down to its last few barrels of gunpowder, and there's no way it could have withstood a direct assault, but thankfully that never took place. And ultimately, of course, it marked a high water point of the Royalist campaign. For after this, the Royals were never in a position really to challenge Parliament again. Parliament was able to link with the Scots, while the Royalists tried to link with the Irish. And it changed the whole course of the war. It bought Parliament a lot of time, and they became quite strong as a result of it. And of course, we all know what happened afterwards. During the Commonwealth, 1652, there was a herald visitation in the county of Gloucester, and Gloucester city was given a new coat of arms presented to them. It incorporated the ancient shield, which is the declare one, which is in the centre there, with the addition of a crest, supporters, and a motto. Feeds Invicta Triumphant, invincible faith triumphs. The crest, which is the lion in the circular battlement, the lions holding a sword and a trowel, was adopted just as a tribute to the spirit of the defenders of Gloucester and how they were able to defeat the king. Of course, this didn't do very well at the Restoration because Charles II hated this. He declared the crest supporters null and void because they were granted in the Commonwealth. The council, city council, refused to abandon them as they argued that the most of it, less the crest, had actually been granted to them in the reign of James I. So, you know, actually surprisingly, Crown didn't pursue it. They could have done, but they didn't. But even so, it wasn't until 1945 that the city felt, you know, brave enough, I guess, to officially get the coat of arms recorded in the College of Arms and have them legally granted to them. So that's why we've got that lovely coat of arms today, you know, a reminder that we did defeat the king. However, we did suffer for it. At the Restoration, Charles did want revenge, but one of the reasons he wanted revenge, it was still thought at the time that Gloucester might be a focus for any future parliamentary uprisings. So in 1662, the town walls were demolished by Lord Herbert. Lord Herbert had already been defeated in Gloucester in 1643, sort of at the Battle of Dyrham. He had a force which was forced away. But the city council then also lost control of the Innshire. And this is a map of the Innshire. You can see it's quite a big map, so I don't do it very small, but you also notice it looks a bit odd, and that's because north is on the right-hand side of this map. So you can see Gloucester in the middle. If you try and turn it that way around, you get the idea. So actually, Gloucester controlled quite a lot of property, but this was basically taken away from them, and they, this is where you get the situation where the parishes in the middle of Gloucester having extramural parts outside. And it's also why the outside is quite confused, especially around some of the areas. Further to this, in 1664, a new royal charter was issued by Charles, confirmed most of the rights of the previous charters, but it did give the king power to control the appointments of the city council's recorder and the town clerk. They were key positions, which meant that with those being royal appointments, they could almost force down and argue against the burgesses, especially if they went down the let's have a parliamentary uprising route. Moving on, George III, our first royal interaction with Farmer George came as this guy, Captain Henry Skillicorn, who was a retired Bristol privateer, basically a licensed pirate. And when his father-in-law died, a chap called William Mason, he'd already married, Skillicorn married his daughter. Mason had already found a sort of spring in Cheltenham, and Skillicorn realised, thanks probably to experience at Hotwells in Bristol, that this could make some money. So he basically improved the spring by doing a brick building, installing a pump, marketing its medical properties, and encouraging visitors to Cheltenham to take the water. He died in 1763, but his son William took over and continued its development. And before long, there were people flocking to this place because they realised the water was so good for them. All this culminated in 1788 with George III, his wife Catherine, three eldest daughters came for a 5-week stay in Cheltenham specifically to take the waters for George's health. Of course, this set the seal on how popular the town was. Of course, then everybody started flocking to the town, which became Regency Cheltenham, and it became very important. This went on. Later visitors included Queen Victoria, who was then Princess, the Duke of Wellington came, and many, many others. One very useful amenity that Skillicorns put up were public conveniences, as the waters exercised a purgative effect of the body, and the cartoonists of the day were not slow to pick up on this. This is a wonderful cartoon here. You can see a man on the left in the toilet, and all the others are banging on the door. There's a very funny pun in here. The gentleman in the blue is here. Is it? Water was so gripe on all my life. Cheltenham used to be called Chittingham. Okay, but the artist here has spelt it as a Shittingham. So it's very, very funny picture. I love these Regency caricatures, they're brilliant. And the poor lady on the right, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, it's all over. So it's, this is part of the thing. And you get loads of these cartoons kicking around. Moving on, get to Queen Victoria again, not a huge interaction, only two really. We have this lovely little letter in the archives written by Queen Victoria to a lady Fanny who resided in Cheltenham. Don't know who she was. This came to us via the Wilson Museum in Cheltenham, and there's no sort of backstory to it, no provenance to it. The letter offers concert tickets to Mr. Benedict's concert. We don't know where this was or when it was. His letter was undated, but it's probable that Mr. Benedict is Sir Julius Benedict, who was a German-born composer and conductor, stayed in England for most of his life. He was a royal favourite, so he had the patronage of the Queen, Albert, and Prince of Wales. And he actually wrote a march for the wedding of Prince Albert Edward with Alexandria in 1863. So we'd love to find out a bit more about this letter, but I suspect we won't. The other main instance with Queen Victoria is, of course, 1849, she travelled back from Balmoral, which they didn't own then at the time, they bought it later. Heading down here by train for the Isle of Wight, they had to change the gauge at Gloucester. So they got to Gloucester, where the Midland track used standard, and they had to switch to the Great Western, which used broad gauge. And again, the Illustrated London News makes a very good picture of this. There is a full military garden display on loads of people around. Literally, the Queen got out of one carriage, walked to the other, and sailed off. So she was in Gloucester for about 15 minutes, we think. So from the 1900s onwards, royal visits became more common, but less formal, more like the walkabouts we see or used to see today. So most of the material that we hold in the archives now relates to celebrations for coronations, jubilees, or funerals. So I've got just a few here to look at. The Jubilee visit of Prince of Wales, 1897. Prince of Wales, with the future King Edward VII, visited Cheltenham, and the borough put on a massive procession from the Midland railway station at Lansdowne to the punt room, where the Prince reviewed the hussars. There are band sports and evening fireworks. One of the good things of this is the Queen's Day Celebration Committee later on arranged for food tickets with 2 shillings to be given to everyone over the age of 60. It's £8 today. Would have bought you a nice pub lunch. And it also gave 6 pence per head for the schools in the town to celebrate the Jubilee with entertainments for the children. So presumably lots of Punch and Judy and things like that. The Coronation of Edward VII, Cheltenham wanted to put a band to play concerts, so they actually asked the first Gloucestershire Royal Engineers volunteers, F. Rowland was their bandmaster, they asked him to give us a quote. So they did, and he wanted £25 a day or £45 for 2 days, so about £2,000 to £3,500 today for 24 performers in military dress to play. He does actually point out, it's a cold hard sell here, that he had refused several good offers already, so you better be quick in booking onto this. For the coronation of George V in 1911, there is a central coronation bonfire committee set up. Now, whether this happened with the Jubilee just gone, I don't know, but it's established to coordinate all these bonfires and beacons. They're all to be lit at 10 p.m, 10:30 in Scotland. Of course, June is 10:30, still daylight, and they would be heralded by 9:55 by magnesium signal rocket, followed by red, white, and blue fires and £5 tins. The committee also advised that Messrs James Payne and Sons were able to supply pyrotechnics at a 25% discount. So you do wonder who had a finger in this pie. If it was today, you'd know half the cabinet would, but we don't know who it was on this coronation one. What's quite interesting with this one is that the committee recommended that peat fires were to be adopted rather than timber and faggots, as the peat burnt one lasted for a good time, which is not the easiest thing to obtain down here. And then the committee followed this diagram for how you should build a peat bonfire. So add flue, air channels, correct stacking of peat, etc., etc. They actually also then recommended that, whether in June, the bonfire should be saturated with petrol, paraffin, or creosote to ensure it would fire up when lit. And very belatedly at the bottom of this page, they say it's probably best people shouldn't gather within 150 feet of this bonfire downwind. So they're a bit worried about them flaring up and killing people. A couple of scenes of proclamations now. This is the proclamation of King George V in 1910 from the Gloucester Guildhall. So this is how they used to do it. I don't know if they did it for Elizabeth or they do it for Charles, we don't know. But the great and the good would gather on the top, and then they would sort of proclaim the new king or queen. This was done before the coronation, but as soon as the old king had died, basically. We've got a few visits. This is the visit of Queen Mary to Sudeley Castle, where she just came to have lunch with the Dent Brocklehursts. She came to Cheltenham on the train, travelled by motorcar to Winchcombe, and the Cheltenham Chronicle took photos of it. So this is, again, a typical royal visit of the day. This is another proclamation to Edward VIII. Very modest crowd. There's not many people there. It was a very wet day, apparently. So they gathered to hear the proclamation and disappeared very quickly. Apparently, the crowd dispersed, according to the Citizen, within about 10 minutes. Interestingly, I like this one. The coronation celebrations of King George VI, which obviously took place quite soon after Edward VIII, Gloucester Borough decided they wanted to decorate the area of the old Roman town really well in style. So they had a big meeting of shop owners and businesses to discuss it. And most of these said, yeah, we'd love to do this. Until the council came back and said, actually, it's going to be about 5 shilling to 10 shilling per foot per shop. So if you've got a shop for 50 feet, it's going to be quite a lot of money. And of course, having seen this figure, nearly all the traders dropped out. And so this memo comes from the council, and it's basically saying, well, actually, nobody wants to do this anymore. It's too expensive. So we're going to have a different scheme, a much reduced decoration, which I think is quite funny, the fact that the traders are fed up of having to do this all the time. Almost at the last slide now. This is the Charter of Queen Elizabeth II. It's the only one we have. It was granted when Gloucester became a district under the Local Government Act of 1972, and it provides the District of Gloucester have the status of a borough with the power to appoint local officers and dignities as exercised prior to 1974. So this is the sort of thing that's done now. And the letters patent just permitted the city to use the term borough and still be a city. Again, interesting on this one, the Queen hasn't signed this at all. It's signed by somebody else called Dixon. And this is the seal on the right-hand side, which hangs below it. So that's where the royal seal. We have a few other royal seals in the archives, but they're mostly damaged, sadly. Seals do tend to get damaged. But that's the one we have. Elizabeth II, who obviously just celebrated a Platinum Jubilee. And I think that's the end of this one. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget, our next talk is on 20th of July. Going to be a good one. Secrets Revealed, only want to laugh, old medicines and cures of Gloucestershire. So thank you for listening. Hope it was okay.
Thank you very much, John. As always, I have learnt a lot from that. There's some questions coming in, so let me just make sure I've got everybody. So Neela says, thank you very much, brilliant talk. And who the second king was murdered in the county? Edward II, and who was the first one, John?
First one was Edmund, King Edmund, one of the early Saxon kings, basically. It's 946. Again, stabbed by this guy called Leof, who was an outlaw. For whatever reason, he got into the royal hunting lodge during a celebration event, and somehow got close to the king and stabbed him. Allegedly stabbed him in the stomach, but we don't know for sure.
Rachel is asking, is it possible to access the Domesday Book online?
Yes, there is. There's lots of versions of Domesday Book online. There are some that actually do the imaging of it, and there are some that just do the transcript of it. There's one that does both on either side. So I can't remember the details on the side, but if you just could put Domesday Book online, you'll find it.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
And there are some specific Gloucester pages, are there, John, that people can find? Or
yeah, the one I use for that one is basically, I think it's just called Domesday Book Online. You go in there and there's a certain window, where do you want to look for? So you put the name in. Of course, what you've got to remember, that despite there's actually two Domesday Books, the Great Book and the Little Book, not everywhere has been done. And it does explain that, well, where has and where hasn't. It uses a map, I think. So, if you're desperately trying to find your place, it's not coming up, be aware that, because it might not have been done, but most of the country was done. Gloucestershire's fairly well covered, I think.
Oh, so Diane says, thank you for an interesting talk. First time, but we'll look out for more. Thank you, Diane.
Excellent. Oh, great.
So if nobody else has any questions, shall we leave it there? And
thanks ever so much, John. Really good.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, they're glad you came. They've got something out of it. It's a tough one to write, that one, because there's so many little bits.
It's so much, isn't it? But it really good at oversight. Yeah, overview. Yeah.
Thank you.
He only finished it yesterday. I'm in a position to tell you.
Oh, wow.
Half past 7 last night I finished it.
Can I just ask one more thing, John? And that is, sorry, you mentioned the Tewkesbury event, which sounds brilliant. I'm going to just look that up. Is that an annual?
Yeah, it's always an annual event. It's normally the first or second weekend in July. So it's a reenactment of the Battle of Tewkesbury. I think the last time it was held, it stopped in 2018 because of COVID. But I think they had, in 2017, there were something like 3,000 reenactors. So they basically, they do it on this next door to the old battlefield site. It's well signposted, lots of parking, it's free to get in. And basically there's a great beer tent with bands in the evening. There's a whole medieval market there, which is great fun. So if you want your cloaks or your swords or your axes, or I always plug Jim the Pot, he does the pottery. So you get yourself a medieval mug for about £6. Brilliant. And then what they do for the battle, it's on a Saturday and a Sunday. They do it both days. They have a march of the armies going onto the battlefield through the public, and then they form up and they have the fights and everything. And there's great commentary done by a local girl called Kat, who I know, she's great. So I say, if you've not been to Reenact before, it's got to be the best one ever to go to. It's really good fun.
Do you still do it, John? Do you still do your reenacting?
I don't do that one very much, no, because I normally do a surgeon stuff, and there's another surgeon who does does that one, but I've been there for the Newport ship, Friends of the Newport ship in costume. It's one of those things, if you don't go in costume, you feel out of place often. So you know, even when we go in civvies, we're a bit sort of like, you know, got a medieval hat on or something. But yeah, it's coming back this year, bigger and better. So, you know, it's well worth a visit, well worth a trip.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Nice to see you all, and see you all in a month's time.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.